Chapter 1. The Crash Landing. Lieutenant Jason Reeve had seen his share of close calls in Earth's Starfleet, but this one felt different. The Hespera system was notorious for its turbulent spatial anomalies and unknown dangers. He had been on a standard reconnaissance mission, tasked with monitoring Zyrene activities on the fringes of contested space. The Zyrene were a mysterious race, enigmatic, technologically advanced, and often described as hauntingly beautiful. Tensions had cooled between humanity and the Zyrene in recent years, edging closer to a truce. Still, his orders were explicit: observe, report, and above all, do not engage. As his small, single-pilot craft glided through the quiet of deep space, Jason let himself relax. The vast darkness around him, broken only by the faint glow of distant stars, had always been a source of solace. But as he drifted closer to the edge of the sector, his sensors picked up an unexpected reading. A foreign ship had entered his radar. His pulse quickened. He identified the ID signature as Zyrene. What was a Zyrene ship doing in human-monitored space? Just as he was about to send a signal back to the fleet, a surge of energy registered on his console blast, powerful and blinding, erupted out of nowhere. Jason's ship shuddered violently as an electric blue wave of energy engulfed it, scrambling his systems and sending his navigation haywire. The ship spun, and alarms blared in his ears as he struggled to stabilize. But the force was too great. He plummeted, helplessly spinning toward the gravitational pull of a nearby planet, with no control over his descent. Jason's final memory before impact was of his ship screaming through the atmosphere, the hull glowing white-hot as it tore toward the surface. When he awoke, he was slumped over his controls, his body aching, bruises blooming beneath his flight suit. His head throbbed, and his vision was blurry, but he forced himself to take stock. The once functional control panels were now sparking in dark, cracked screens hanging uselessly. He reached up, his fingers coming away sticky with blood from a gash on his forehead. But he was alive. He pushed open the emergency hatch, wincing as it groaned, and stumbled out onto the hard ground. His surroundings were alien, barren, red-tinged landscape stretched as far as his eyes could see. Jagged rocks jutted out of the ground like broken teeth, and the air shimmered under the oppressive heat of the star blazing too close in the sky. It was unbearably hot, the air thin and barely breathable, making each breath a struggle. Jason squinted into the distance, shielding his eyes against the glare, and spotted something metallic glinting under the harsh sunlight. As he approached cautiously, he realized it was another wreck, a ship that looked far sleeker and more advanced than his own. His heart hammered in his chest. Zyrene. Just as he was processing the sight, a figure emerged from the wreckage. The woman, no, the alien, was tall and slender, her skin a soft silver that shimmered even in the brutal light. She had striking emerald green eyes, her gaze cool and guarded, and ridged horns that swept back from her temples like delicate, curved blades. She wore a form-fitting suit made of a material he'd never seen, layered with protective panels that bore the Zyrene insignia. Her movements were slow, graceful, though he could tell she was injured. They stared at each other across the red sands, the silence filled with tension. She straightened, her expression wary as her eyes traveled over him, assessing the unfamiliar sight of a human in the flesh. They were enemies by circumstance, belonging to races that had clashed and competed for dominance in the galaxy. But here, on this desolate world, they were both survivors. Jason's instinct told him to stay on guard, but something about her presence stirred a sense of wonder and curiosity he couldn't ignore. Finally, he raised his hand in a gesture of peace. "I'm Jason," he said, keeping his tone calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. She watched him for a long, tense moment, her expression unreadable. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and melodic, though tinged with a suspicion that mirrored his own. "Lysara, Zyrene Scout." Their words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Neither of them moved closer, but the awareness that they were alone on this planet, stranded, vulnerable, was undeniable. Lysara's eyes shifted to the shattered remains of his ship, then back to him, and he could see the wheels turning in her mind, weighing options, considering possibilities. "We're stuck here," he ventured, feeling the weight of the reality settle over him. She gave a curt nod. "So it seems." Together, They set aside their mutual distrust long enough to assess the situation. Both of their ships were beyond repair, and communications were dead. Their chances of signaling for help were slim. Survival, they realized grimly, would require cooperation, no matter how uneasy it felt. As the relentless heat beat down on them, they agreed to work together to construct a makeshift shelter. Jason scavenged metal scraps from his ship to build a frame, while Lasara used the advanced fabric from hers to create a reflective barrier, which helped deflect some of the heat. It wasn't much, but it provided them a small respite from the scorching sun and the eerie, unfamiliar creatures that lurked just out of sight, their silhouettes flickering in the distance. Lasara maintained her distance, her movements graceful but cautious, watching him with a wariness that matched his own. Jason knew she was studying him, just as he was studying her, both of them trying to understand the other without lowering their guard. Her face remained an impassive mask, betraying none of the emotions he assumed must be simmering beneath the surface. But every now and then, he caught her glancing at him, a flicker of curiosity softening her features for just a heartbeat before she returned to her stoic demeanor. As night fell, the temperature dropped drastically, leaving them huddled together in the thin shelter they had managed to cobble together. The darkness brought new sounds, the distant, unsettling calls of alien creatures and the shifting sands stirred by unseen forces. Jason shivered despite himself, acutely aware of Lasara's presence beside him, her steady breathing the only sound that kept the oppressive silence at bay. They exchanged only the barest words, each one carefully chosen, as if speaking too much would break the fragile truce that held them together. But in those quiet moments, as the strange stars glittered coldly above them, he felt a strange sense of kinship with her. Here, stripped of their duties and allegiances, they were just two beings, alone and lost on a hostile planet, bound together by necessity. For the first time, Jason began to wonder if they could be more than enemies, more than reluctant allies. Perhaps, in this isolated corner of the universe, they could find something deeper, a connection that transcended the boundaries of their species and the history of their peoples. But he kept those thoughts to himself, letting the silence envelop them as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of silver skin and emerald eyes. Here's Chapter 2 in expanded detail. I'll deepen the dynamics of survival and trust building between Jason and Lasara, along with the challenges they face and the subtle yet growing connection between them. Chapter 2. Survival and Alliance. The oppressive heat of the planet was relentless, bearing down on them with each passing day. Jason and Lasara worked in tense, silent harmony, each step they took further cementing an unspoken understanding. They were two survivors in an alien wilderness, bound by the silent pact to survive together despite the invisible chasm between them. Their shelter was makeshift at best, a small, reflective dome made from Lasara's salvage materials. It shielded them from the brunt of the blazing sun, but the unforgiving environment continued to test their limits. Lasara, with her advanced knowledge of Zyrene survival techniques, devised a small energy shield around their encampment to ward off the night predators. Jason watched in fascination as she worked, her slender fingers moving deftly over alien technology he couldn't begin to understand. Days turned into an exhausting blur of heat and hardship. Every morning, they set out in search of water, each journey a grueling trek over sharp rocks and burning sands. Lasara remained reticent, speaking only when necessary, and even then, her words were clipped and formal. Jason felt her distrust as a constant weight between them, but he respected her boundaries, keeping his own words to a minimum. They both understood that their survival depended on a delicate balance, a willingness to cooperate without overstepping. One evening, as they returned from a long search for water with only a handful of drops to show for their efforts, Jason noticed Lasara eyeing her food rations with an uncomfortable expression. She was inspecting the packet, her brows knitted in a slight frown. "What's wrong?" Jason ventured, trying to keep his tone neutral. Her silence in recent days had been unyielding, but the flicker of frustration in her gaze hinted at a crack in her stoic exterior. Lasara hesitated before responding, a flicker of vulnerability softening her sharp gaze. "Human food," she said, almost distastefully. "It reacts poorly with Zyrene physiology." Jason gave a small nod of understanding, reaching into his own pack to retrieve his final ration packet. "Here, Take mine. I'll be fine with just water for now." Lasara's eyes narrowed, her suspicion immediately surfacing. "Why would you give me your last ration?" Jason shrugged, attempting to downplay the gesture. "We're in this together, right? Besides, I'll manage. You're better with energy shields and tech, so you'll be more useful if you're not starving." Her expression softened, and for a brief moment, she looked almost grateful, though the intensity of her gaze made Jason's heart pound in a way he hadn't expected. She accepted the ration silently, breaking eye contact as she took a cautious bite. It was a small moment, a subtle shift, but it marked the first crack in the wall of distrust that had kept them apart. As the days stretched on, the two of them began to fall into a rhythm, working together more seamlessly, even finding moments to exchange stories in the rare lulls between their grueling survival tasks. Jason listened intently as Lasara spoke of her home planet, a place of lush crystal forests and towering cities that shimmered under a sky with twin moons. She described the Zyrene as a people bound by duty and order, every member of their society born into roles that defined their lives from the start. Jason was captivated by her stories, and a part of him envied her for the sense of purpose she described, though he could hear the underlying tension in her words, the quiet longing that hinted at something more. "So, everything's decided for you from birth?" Jason asked one evening as they sat under the dimming light of the fading sun. "You're a soldier because someone else said so?" Lasara's gaze dropped, her fingers idly tracing patterns in the dust. "Yes, I am Lasara, daughter of the House of Myron, first in line to my family's legacy. To serve in the fleet is my duty." She paused, her eyes distant. "It's all I've ever known." Jason nodded, feeling a pang of empathy. "That sounds difficult. Back on Earth, we have choices. It's not perfect, but most people can decide their own paths." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Choice. It's something Zyrene are taught to view as unnecessary. Freedom is a luxury we believe makes society weaker." Her gaze softened as she met his eyes. "But here, with you, I'm beginning to wonder if we were wrong." Their conversations grew deeper, each one stripping away layers of formality and mistrust. Jason found himself drawn to Lasara's strength, her resilience, and the quiet vulnerability she hid beneath her stoic facade. In her presence, he felt a strange connection he couldn't quite explain, a pull towards something unfamiliar and forbidden. She was an enigma, and he was captivated by every part of her. Chapter 3. A Dangerous Closeness. Surviving on this barren planet was an unending trial. Each day a grueling test of endurance against the brutal heat and the constant search for food and water. The thin atmosphere left them both drained and gasping for air by midday, and the unyielding terrain was a constant danger, every step risking a twisted ankle or worse. Yet despite it all, Jason and Lasara had settled into a rhythm, an unspoken partnership that became their lifeline. In those first days, they'd forage the area around their camp, scavenging for any edible plants or moisture-bearing stones they could find. But as their meager resources dwindled, they were forced to venture further out, into the planet's unforgiving heart. Their journey took them to the edges of deep ravines, where strange fungal growths clung to the walls, glowing faintly in the dim light. They discovered that these growths, though bitter and tough, could be consumed in small quantities without harmful effects, a discovery that became a crucial lifeline. One particular expedition took them to a cliffside that loomed over a vast, empty chasm. The fungal growths they needed were clustered along the cliff's edge, where the rock was brittle and treacherous. Jason was uneasy as they approached, his instincts warning him of the danger. But they had no choice, their supplies were low, and they needed to replenish them if they were to survive. As they carefully picked their way down the cliff face, Lasara took the lead, her movements precise and controlled. Jason followed, watching her with a mixture of admiration and worry. She was incredibly skilled, moving with a balance and grace that belied her strength. But as she reached for a cluster of fungus clinging to a jagged outcrop, the rock beneath her crumbled. Jason's heart lurched as she lost her footing, her body tipping backward over the cliff's edge. Without thinking, he lunged forward, grabbing her wrist just as she fell. For a heartbeat, they hung in the balance, her life quite literally in his hands. The strain was immense, his muscles burning as he held her suspended over the void. Lysara's emerald eyes widened, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps as she realized the depth of the chasm below her. "Hold on!" he shouted. His voice strained as he fought to pull her back up. With a supreme effort, he managed to haul her up, their bodies colliding as she stumbled back onto solid ground. For a moment, they stood frozen, her chest rising and falling rapidly, their faces inches apart. His heart was still pounding, adrenaline racing through him as he realized how close he had come to losing her. Lysara's gaze was locked onto his, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something he couldn't quite define shining in her eyes. Without thinking, he reached out, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. Her skin was cool beneath his fingers, smooth and unearthly in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. Time seemed to slow, the sounds of the hostile world around them fading into a distant hum as they stood there, bound by a connection that defied logic. He didn't know who moved first. Perhaps it was both of them, drawn together by an invisible force neither could resist. But in that moment, their lips met, a tentative, almost uncertain kiss that quickly deepened as they surrendered to the pull between them. It was a kiss filled with longing, with the pent-up emotion of days spent in tense proximity, with the unspoken bond they had forged through shared hardship. For that brief moment, they were no longer human and Zyrene, no longer soldier and alien. They were simply Jason and Lysara, two souls reaching out to each other in the midst of an indifferent universe. The kiss broke the barriers they had maintained, a silent acknowledgement of the trust that had blossomed between them. But as they pulled apart, reality settled back over them, stark and unforgiving. Lysara's expression was conflicted, her eyes searching his as if trying to understand the emotions that had taken hold of them both. "This isn't possible," she murmured, her voice laced with a mixture of regret and confusion. Jason nodded, though his heart protested the words. "I know, but here, on this planet, maybe it doesn't matter." She looked away, her gaze distant as she grappled with the implications of what they had just shared. "In our worlds, it matters. You know that." He reached out, his fingers brushing her arm in a gesture of reassurance. "Then maybe we just focus on surviving for now. Let the rest come later." Her eyes softened, a reluctant smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Very practical, Lieutenant." They shared a quiet laugh, a moment of levity in the face of their grim circumstances. But as they turned to make their way back to camp, Jason felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever the future held, he knew he wasn't alone in facing it. They were no longer just allies by necessity, they were partners, bound by something deeper than survival. Back at their shelter, the atmosphere between them had changed. The silence was no longer tense, but comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding that needed no words. They worked together more seamlessly, their movements almost synchronized as they prepared their meager meal of fungus and water. Jason caught her gaze more than once, a faint blush coloring her cheeks as she quickly looked away. That night, as they lay side by side under the thin blanket they shared, Jason found himself acutely aware of her presence. The warmth of her body was a comfort against the chill of the night air, and he could feel her breathing, steady and calm. It was a strange feeling, lying there beside her, an alien, someone he had once thought of as an enemy. But in this desolate place, she was the only thing that felt real, the only anchor in a world that seemed to shift and change with every passing day. He drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of her silver skin and emerald eyes, her touch lingering like a ghost. He woke in the middle of the night to find her awake, her gaze fixed on the stars above them. Her expression was pensive, almost melancholy, and he wondered what thoughts weighed on her mind. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft in the quiet. She glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the distant starlight. "I was just thinking about everything. About us." Jason hesitated, sensing the gravity of her words. "What about us?" She sighed, her gaze returning to the stars. "We're from different worlds, Jason. Worlds that don't accept this. Whatever this is. Even if we survive this place, what happens when we go back?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the reality of their situation. Jason had no answer, but he reached out, taking her hand in his. "I don't know. But I do know that right now, here, none of that matters. We're just two people, trying to survive. And maybe, Maybe that's enough. She looked at him, her eyes softening as she squeezed his hand. Maybe it is. They lay there in silence, their fingers entwined, drawing comfort from each other's presence as they faced the uncertain future together. It was a fragile peace, a brief respite from the harshness of their reality. But in that moment, it was all they needed. Chapter 4. A choice between love and duty. The morning sun rose over the desolate landscape, casting an orange hue across the barren cliffs and rugged sands. Jason and Lasara were already up, silently preparing for another long trek to search for food. Their movements were synchronized, a testament to the unspoken bond they had forged over weeks of survival. But there was a subtle shift in the air, an undercurrent of tension that neither could ignore. They hadn't spoken of the kiss again, hadn't dared to discuss the feelings that had blossomed between them. Yet it lingered, filling the space between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of a connection that defied their differences. As they worked side by side, Jason couldn't help but steal glances at her, drawn to the quiet strength and resilience that had captivated him since that first day. Lasara's beauty was unlike anything he had ever known, elegant and haunting, with an otherworldly grace that seemed almost unreal in the harsh light of this barren planet. But today, there was something else on her face, a flicker of worry that she tried to hide but couldn't entirely mask. He noticed the way her gaze drifted toward the sky, scanning the horizon as if searching for something. "Expecting someone?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. She hesitated, her gaze shifting to meet his. "I've been monitoring the signal from my ship's distress beacon. The Zyrene fleet is close. They'll likely find us within the next day or so." Jason felt a pang in his chest, a mixture of relief and dread. They had been waiting for rescue, clinging to the hope of returning to their own worlds. But now that it was imminent, he couldn't shake the feeling of impending loss. "That's good news," he said, though the words felt hollow. Lasara's expression softened, and she took a step closer, her eyes searching his face. "Yes, it is. But it also means—" She trailed off, struggling to find the words. He nodded, understanding what she couldn't bring herself to say. Once they were rescued, everything they had shared on this planet, the closeness, the connection, the fragile romance that had grown between them would be torn apart by duty, by the realities of their worlds. Humanity and the Zyrene were not allies. Their people would see their bond as a betrayal, a violation of everything they had been raised to believe. They spent the day in uneasy silence, going through the motions of survival, but each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of what was to come hung over them like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over every shared glance, every brush of fingers as they passed tools back and forth. Jason's heart ached with a longing he couldn't fully understand, a desperation to hold onto this fragile, forbidden love that had bloomed in the unlikeliest of places. As night fell, they sat side by side outside their shelter, watching the stars appear one by one in the inky sky. The silence was heavy, charged with the unspoken words that lay between them. Finally, Lasara turned to him, her expression vulnerable in a way he had never seen before. "Jason," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I don't want this to end, but I don't know if there's a future for us outside of this place." He reached out, taking her hand in his thumb brushing over the smooth, cool skin of her fingers. "I know," he said softly, his heart breaking even as he tried to hold on to the hope that maybe, somehow, they could defy the odds. "But we'll always have this. No matter what happens, no one can take away what we shared here." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder as they sat in silence, drawing comfort from each other in the face of an uncertain future. They stayed like that for hours, wrapped in each other's warmth, letting the silence speak for the feelings they couldn't express in words. The next morning, the distant rumble of engines shattered the quiet, signaling the arrival of the Zyrene fleet. Jason's heart raced as he watched the sleek, silver ships descending from the sky, their engines roaring as they touched down on the barren ground. Beside him, Lasara's expression was stoic, her eyes fixed on the ships with a mixture of relief and resignation. The Zyrene soldiers disembarked, their movements precise and disciplined as they approached. Jason felt a wave of unease as he watched them, their cool, impassive expressions a stark contrast to the warmth and emotion he had come to know in Lasara. One of the soldiers stepped forward, his gaze flickering briefly over Jason before turning to Lasara with a respectful bow. "Lady Lasara," he said, his voice clipped and formal, "we have come to escort you back to the fleet. The council is awaiting your safe return." She nodded, her expression unreadable as she glanced at Jason, a silent farewell in her eyes. But before she could step forward, a second set of engines roared in the distance, and Jason's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the familiar shape of Earth's Starfleet ships descending onto the planet's surface. His own people had arrived, and with them came the realization that their time together was over. The Earth soldiers disembarked, their faces familiar yet strangely foreign after weeks of isolation. Jason felt a pang of guilt as he saw the worry and relief in their eyes, knowing they had come for him, risking their lives to rescue one of their own. He turned back to Lasara, his heart aching with the knowledge that this was the end. As the two groups stood facing each other, the atmosphere was tense, filled with an unspoken tension that crackled in the air. Jason's commanding officer stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over Lasara with a wary expression. "Lieutenant Reeve, are you all right?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. Jason nodded, forcing himself to focus. "Yes, sir. I'm fine." The officer's gaze lingered on Lasara, suspicion evident in his eyes. "And the Zyrene? Did they treat you fairly?" Jason hesitated, glancing at Lasara. She saved my life, sir. We wouldn't have survived without each other." The officer's expression softened, but he still looked at Lasara with a mixture of distrust and caution. Lasara met his gaze with calm defiance, her own people watching her with a similar expression of guarded loyalty. For a moment, Jason dared to hope that perhaps their people could see the bond they had formed, could understand that there was more to this than duty and allegiance. But as he met Lasara's gaze, he knew that was a hope too fragile to hold on to. They belonged to different worlds, worlds that would never understand what they had shared. And as much as it pained him, he knew that letting go was the only choice. She stepped back, her eyes filled with unspoken words, and he felt a tear slip down his cheek as he watched her turn away. In that moment, he realized that he was losing something precious, something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As she was led away by her people, he took a deep breath, fighting the urge to call her back, to defy the rules and risk everything for a chance at something more. But he knew he couldn't. Their love was a secret, a forbidden bond forged in the fires of survival, and it was a secret that would remain with him, hidden in the deepest part of his heart. As he boarded the Starfleet ship, he cast one last look at her, a silent promise that he would never forget. She met his gaze, a faint, sad smile on her lips, and then she was gone, swallowed up by the silver ships of the Zyrene fleet. As the engines roared to life and the ship lifted off, Jason felt a hollow ache in his chest, a sense of loss that went beyond words. But as he looked out the window, watching the planet shrink beneath them, he knew that he had gained something far more precious, a memory, a moment, a love that would live on, even if the universe could never accept it. In the quiet of his cabin, he closed his eyes, letting the memory of her linger, a light in the darkness that would guide him through the long, lonely journey ahead. And as he drifted into sleep, he whispered a silent farewell to the woman who had changed him in ways he couldn't begin to understand, hoping that somewhere, in the vastness of the stars, she was thinking of him too.